With a lot of the customers we talk to, we see different perspectives, different opinions, very strong opinions, sometimes on both sides of the aisle, with customers who have print servers, love print servers, couldn't live without them, to customers who have moved on from them, will never look back, and are very happy managing printing without them. So I think one of the things that we wanted to talk about was like, what are we hearing and seeing most often with the feedback we do get from the customers, because this is such a hot topic. So I'm Zach, Lander-Portnoy from Tricerat. I'm here with Andrew Parlette. And one of our topic clusters that we put out content around is this very sort of debate, if you will, or argument.
Yeah, it is.
Print servers or direct IP, which approach is better, what works more reliably for different IT infrastructures. And I think one of the primers for this was a blog that we put out back in December. That was our #1 most trafficked blog, specifically around this topic, with customers or interested parties spending up to 7 minutes per research cycle kind of looking at this. So clearly it's a topic that interests our customers and the community at large. So we wanted to sit down and kind of talk about what we're hearing.
Yeah, well, one way I think about this is just like looking back over the history of 30, even 40 years now of Windows and PC computing and how it affects the enterprise environment. Sometimes today you hear the word print server and it harkens back to NT 351 back in 1994. I mean, there were file and print servers. It almost feels in some ways like this archaic term now, but yet here we are in 2025. And the core concepts of that print server device still hold true today. And I think sometimes there's a tendency to dismiss it because, that was like an old style of doing things. Well, in every other way of IT management, we've modernized. We have better forms of management and dashboards and monitoring and real-time information and these sorts of things. The print server, the core aspect of it can still be brought forward in this modern environment, but modernized in terms of how we manage it, how it functions, making sure that it's scalable and easily deployed and all these things. And so having the concept of the print server, but a modernized layer on top of it is really what ultimately makes the big difference.
Do you think there's a negative connotation with the term print server where there might be like a visceral reaction? People hear it and they think about these giant on-prem environments, these big data centers, these physical server rooms. But to your point, print servers have evolved, and that's not what we see in modern hybrid virtual or cloud environments now.
Right. Well, I think it comes from a few different aspects. One is like that, hey, I don't want these huge clunky boxes in the data center. I want to get this to the cloud. Let's get rid of all on-prem. But of course, there are reasons in your infrastructure to still dedicate, a modern stack to the print services. The other way it gets a bad rap is there were definitely times where, because of print drivers and the way the Windows spooler worked, and really just Windows Server in general, when a print server crashed, it caused so many problems in the environment. And to a point, that holds true today, but there are so many more pieces in there to really prevent just flat out complete failure of the print servers, especially if you're layering on better visibility, better monitoring, better scalability in terms of the services. And so there's definitely ways, and the underlying print drivers certainly make a difference too. And some of that is just over the years from Microsoft and the print vendors. They do a better job of it now. And so you can put all these pieces together into a modern and effective stack to kind of get rid of some of those problems that we had 10, 20 years ago that maybe some IT admins still hold on to.
And that could probably be said about almost anything in like a software tech stack today that a system administrator is charged with monitoring and managing. There's so many different components that if they don't work, then you're going to have this perspective of them as just being like awful, terrible, and hard to manage. But things have changed, to your point, over the last 15, 20 years, where the core value proposition of a print server is still there. It's still mainly designed to centralize the processing of the print jobs and do so in a way that allows for, again, a more centralized approach to driver management.
Right.
And I'm curious, what have you seen in terms of the evolution of the load and what a print server can reliably do now versus a decade ago?
Yeah, and a decade ago, there were always numbers bantied about, usually in the hundreds, where like, do not go over this number. The thought of having 1,000 printers, print queues on a print server was risking it big time. But now we see much higher loads. We've seen 1,000, 2,000, even upwards from there, print queues on a server. If it's done effectively, and usually that kind of depends on how many different print drivers. So I might have 2,000 queues, but if they're all using, just a handful of drivers, that certainly helps. And that's kind of the modernization of the universal driver from like the Lexmarks and the Xerox and the Canon and these manufacturers. And then having a service that can sit on top of the Windows print spooler. The Windows print spooler has come a long way, but it's still a single-threaded, needs to be carefully managed. But if you have a service from a modern print vendor that is handling all the incoming traffic and then handing that off to the spooler in an effective way, that's what really enables scalability of, into the thousands of print queues on a print server.
And with respect to reliability specifically, you talked about, print server crashes being incredibly detrimental to a printing environment. What are ways that customers are building more like redundancy and failover into print server environments where sort of that initial fear of, this is a single point of failure, how are they mitigating that today?
Yeah, good question. And really virtualization at the heart of it. And we work so much in VDI and virtualization environments. But having that virtualization layer where I can, live migrate servers or, see a server that's having a problem and automatically like spin up a new image or move that to a different host. So that already gives you a lot more options than kind of the clunky single box that's sitting over in the corner. So the virtualization layer, the ability in Windows, you might have networking devices that can load balance these, or in modern print management like Tricerat screwdrivers, being able to actually set up redundant print servers so that if traffic can't make it to one, we can automatically redirect it to another. So you have multiple layers that then you can get both high availability, but also redundancy in terms of like a disaster recovery scenario.
And I think, an important, component of this also is there's so many different types of printing that are happening, in an enterprise environment, from simple 8.5 by 11 printing to a multi-function printer or an MFP, to barcode or thermal transfer label printing,
right,
to check printing or printing from an accounting type system. And depending on the type of printer that's being used, it's going to need, again, a software component to control that print job, and that's what the print driver is. Are you seeing more that the value of a print server is definitely in environments with many different types of printers, different manufacturer printers, a lot of print drivers to manage, where taking that print server out, you still have to manage the drivers somehow?
And I'd use the term hybrid. There's hybrid print paths that you might have depending on how distributed your desktops are. So you might have everything in one location, you might have different locations, the number of manufacturers and physical devices, the number of drivers like you mentioned. But also talk about like what's in the cloud, what's on-prem, what's in different data centers. And so even when we go into cloud, like we see these trends where the majority of environments are certainly moving some workloads to the cloud, but very few have moved all workloads to the cloud. So you end up with these hybrid environments where you might have an environment where the print server's running a VM in the cloud. It might be on-prem because ultimately the traffic has to get to the physical locations wherever the users are and wherever the physical devices are. And almost always in kind of these larger environments, you're dealing with all of that together. So again, it's pulling a whole bunch of different drivers, printers, users, applications, platforms, cloud and on-prem, all of that into a single management interface. I'd even ask you, as we work in different industries and verticals, we see some of these where, yes, there's always this kind of hybrid, complex types of setups, but also where printing is a critical piece of their business. What areas do we normally see that happening in?
So it typically goes hand in hand. As the high volume printing environments are also the business critical printing environments, right, are also the environments that have a ton of different types and manufacturers of printers. Certainly the healthcare vertical and what we call BSIFI, but banking services, financial and insurance, are probably two of the largest. Within healthcare, because as an operation, it's 24/7 by 365. There's printing happening across a hospital or healthcare organization at all hours of the day, all departments. And I think what we see more often now than maybe what we did, 5 or 10 years ago, is that, call it decentralization of the workforce, where you have more home healthcare being administered, more remote facilities and clinics that are spinning up to bring healthcare closer to the patient. And so it's funny you mentioned kind of the, there's an on-prem nature that can't be removed with printing. There's also an on-prem nature that really can't be removed with healthcare to some extent. There's sort of that service that a patient is going to expect at some point in the process where they're going to want to be talking physically to a doctor or a nurse or a healthcare practitioner. And with printing, there's sort of the two pieces that you can't virtualize is the physical printer and then the person. Those two things are always going to be in the physical world right next to each other for them to work. So what makes that, again, challenging in this modernization conversation is the workloads, the applications, the hosting. These are elements that get moved, again, in more of like a cloud or a virtual infrastructure, but someone still has to be there to physically take a piece of paper out of a printer and hand it to a patient upon discharge.
That's right, yeah.
And so I think we see a lot of that, certainly within healthcare, but also in some of these other, again, industries where printing is business critical, it has to work all the time. Bad things happen when printing doesn't work, and it negatively impacts both the admins, the users, and the patients or the customers of the institution. One of the things that I'm curious about, kind of on the other side of the coin, is without print servers and managing drivers, in these types of environments, can you tell us a little bit more about this direct IP? What does direct IP mean? How is it used? How is this managed without a print server?
Yeah, there are environments where that makes more sense. The nice thing about the print server, like we've been talking about here, is centralization, bringing all of that into a VM, a server, maybe just a few, and then having more direct control over what print drivers are installed and utilized in my environment, and having that central management. When we talk about direct IP printing, we're talking about having the application that's on the desktop have the physical access to the print driver. When we're talking about direct IP printing, normally what we're talking about is having the actual desktop where the application's running have direct interface to the print driver, and then from there immediately to the print device itself. So instead of trafficking up to a print server and then back out to the printer, it's what we call direct, straight from that desktop to the printer. So what environments does this make sense in? A lot of times if you really have a distributed environment where having a print server in a data center or cloud, all the traffic's always going to be routed over the ring. Well, if I can just have the individual desktops that are out at these different locations print directly to the printers nearby, you're optimizing the traffic. So sometimes in that kind of a network setup, that's the best case, because you're now choosing the path that is the shortest, really. But the concerns is now you are usually relying on like Windows Update or some other device push to get the drivers out to those desktops. So you might still have some control from the administrator, but it's an extra layer that you have to make sure how you're distributing the print drivers, which ones are being used, by whom and what devices. Where if you can bring that all into the central location, now you have that place where, okay, based on who's logging into like a virtual desktop or a laptop, all right, now I'm defining exactly what print driver is used, the path to that print device, and then I can see all of that flowing through my data center and through my server.
Is it a linear distinction where you see print servers as more valuable in a VDI environment and direct as more valuable in a workstation or non-VDI environment, or is it a little bit more maybe nuanced and sophisticated than that?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it exactly linear. It's not like definitely everything in this column and not in that column. But I think we do see, if you're in that kind of a world of mostly centralized VDI kind of access, or centralized in terms of location, like I have several larger locations and I'm managing everything within those spots, those tend to be the cases where print servers really shine, make a lot of sense. In kind of the more distributed environments, there are still those cases where, for reasons we talked about centralized management and having all that traffic flow, and these kind of WAN environments are so good and strong now that having an extra hop for the benefits of having that centralized print server management still a lot of times makes sense. But if you really have very small pockets of individual desktops and printers, that might be where it sways a little bit. But I'd always, as an admin, take a look at, again, the different complexity of the devices, how dynamic the sessions are and the configurations within, my mix of cloud, on-prem, data center, these type of things.
Yeah, you're right. So it's a little more nuanced where you're sort of looking at a combination, if I understand you correctly, sort of three different elements. Number one is, how centralized is your overall IT stack? Mm-hmm. Two, how centralized or relatively central are the users, are the people that are actually doing the printing? Are they all coming to the same, general location that's all managed by the same IT infrastructure? And then it's the printers. If those are all in, again, the same locations that the users and the same locations that the IT infrastructure, those are perfect opportunities for print servers. Whereas if everything is remote, is decentralized, if you have, this 1-to-1 ratio of a user and a printer and a clinic, and there's hundreds, all around the country, nothing centralized to begin with. So those might make more sense for like a direct IP approach.
I think that summarizes it perfectly. And the mixed approach, this doesn't even have to be binary within an organization. It might be where 90% can be effectively done and optimally done using a print server, but then you have a few edge cases. And again, as you get that, the modernized managed print layer there, that's where then I can automatically tie these together, have mostly focused on the print server, but then the edge cases picked up through direct IP.
And I'm glad you brought up kind of the mixed use case, because I think that's where we get the most, I would say, frustration from the customer base is mixing and matching the wrong way. Meaning, trying to manage a print server for a decentralized workforce is very hard. Trying to manage without a print server in a very centralized location or a headquarters is also maddening sometimes. And so we see these environments where customers will try and do more of like a direct IP only approach for their entire fleet, right. And that doesn't work. But it also doesn't work to do print servers for your entire environment also. And so having, again, the flexibility to be able to do both seems to be coming up more and more, again, in sort of these like, call it spoke and wheel type scenarios where maybe the print servers work for 90% of your processing in like a headquarters or a main facility or a main hospital, but all these little remote pieces on the end, those are those edge cases where you need a solution that can kind of do both.
Exactly.
One of the questions that I do get often is sort of which approach is right for me, mm-hmm. And that's a complicated question because the answer might be print server-based printing, it might be direct, but it also a lot of times is going to be both. Mm-hmm. It's going to be dependent on a number of factors. One is what infrastructure have they invested in today? We're rarely coming in to a brand new startup organization that's building everything from the ground up. And so understanding what infrastructure the customer's invested in today, do they already have print servers? Typically, if someone has print servers, but they're having challenges with them, there's again ways that management can be done more effectively and more efficiently. On the flip side, if a customer doesn't have print servers, there might not be a reason to necessarily spin them up. So I think understanding where a customer is today and what investments they've made in the infrastructure is really important, because rarely, can you think of an opportunity where someone has been completely ground up and has zero infrastructure, and then it's like in a bubble they're asking which one's better?
On rare occasion, but generally speaking, like if we're talking to someone and describing their environment and they have like one set of printers and one driver, like congratulations, you got it easy, like roll with it. But in 99+% of the cases, that's not the case. And, it might be because of overtime, it might be because of different use cases. There's all sorts of business reasons why things get, complex. And so I think those three things of the variety of drivers that you have, a lot of different drivers in use definitely cause for centralizing that, trying to control that via a centralized management platform, usually a print server. But I've seen environments where they've had like all one brand of printer, so they really only have like one universal driver, and that's not an issue anymore. But still, the fleet of physical devices and dynamically assigning those out to users still is a big, difficult load on the IT staff. And so having a way to dynamically assign that, and the flexibility that Print Servers offers in those locations is usually the right answer. Again, it could be direct IP, but if I'm just trying to dynamically assign out printers, especially in thin client and VDI, Print Servers really shine there. And then lastly, how persistent are the desktops? If you're non-persistent VDI, almost always the answer is going to be Print Servers. Could you make it work with native direct IP printing? But why? Like, there's so many more advantages to having that dynamic driver and not managing drivers coming and going from these non-persistent images. Now, the complete flip side is like my physical laptop. That I'm not resetting every day. Having a driver installed there, especially if it's a physical desktop where I'm generally using the same printer all the time anyway, well, just do direct IP. The driver comes down, it installs, and so that's kind of where it flips over to the direct IP side. But back to the beginning, where diversity of driver, diversity of just number of different physical devices, and then how persistent those desktops are would probably be my three answers.
For sure, and coming back to, why? Why are we looking to get rid of or move on from Print Servers? Is it because it's the right fit for the environment, or is it because we've had a bad experience with it, or we haven't managed it properly before, or we just don't know or are aware of tools that will help us do that better? I think that's really important. If there's a technical value proposition around why we shouldn't be using Print Servers, I think that's one perspective which we've covered in terms of the edge use cases or the remote printing or the individual or the less complex environments. But if the answer is simply, well, we don't want them because this one crashed in 2018 and my boss sent me an email and it got all the way up to the VP of IT. There's tools out there that, again, can make managing things a little bit better. And this to use a sports analogy, reminds me of like deadlifting with weight training, where for years deadlifting has been the single best way to build full body strength. But then, as you kind of got into like the mid to late 90s, professional athletes were throwing their back out doing deadlifting. And then it became this whole, it's not worth it, to put yourself at risk of injury. But if you do it the right way, if you brace your core, if you're using the right form, like there's ways that you can do it, again, very safely. And so certainly Print Servers have gotten like a really bad rap to some extent, over the last 5 to 10 years. But there's incredible value in having a centralized processing with the power to handle the workloads in some of these 24/7 by 365 environments.
And we've seen a lot of environments that have wholesale gone away from Print Servers, and now in quite a few cases coming back. And kind of to your point of sometimes it was a little bit of a knee-jerk of just like, well, I don't want any on-prem, or I want to reduce my Microsoft licenses, which I can sympathize with for sure. But if it's the best tool for the job, sometimes the rush to the cloud, it's like, oh, well, I'm going to the cloud, I can't have on-prem Print Servers. Well, sometimes having the Print Servers and a VM in the cloud makes sense. Or you might have to look at it and say, you know what, the optimal computing environment here is to have a small on-prem solution that can transfer things from the cloud or from remote locations through to my physical realm where I am right here, right now. And so, yes, we're seeing now the tide kind of leveling out, where there are some reasons to eliminate Print Servers or to shift to direct IP, but there's a lot of times where it is the right solution for the job, especially in the modern context with the solutions that we have today to manage it.